Antonio Ramirez sat silently by the small window of his room, the sunlight filtering through the dusty blinds. Below, the city buzzed with life, honking cars, distant chatter, and the occasional bark of a dog. But within the walls of his cramped space, there was only stillness. He traced the rim of his porcelain coffee cup with his calloused fingers, his eyes lingering on the photograph propped against the windowsill. It was of Maria, his late wife, smiling warmly in the garden of their old farmhouse. The colors in the photo had faded with time, but the memories were vivid: her laughter, the smell of fresh earth, and the feel of her hand in his. The room felt more like a temporary holding cell than a home. A twin bed with an iron frame, a dresser filled with clothes he rarely wore, and a small chair tucked into the corner. This was the space Antonio had called his own since moving in with his son Carlos and daughter-in-law Elena. It had been nearly 2 years, but the walls still felt unfamiliar, like they were rejecting him as much as he wanted to reject them. Carlos had insisted it was the best option after the fire. "You'll be safer here, Papa," he'd said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Antonio had reluctantly agreed, not wanting to burden Carlos, whose job as an architect kept him busy from dawn till dusk. Elena, kind as she was, had a full schedule as a schoolteacher, leaving little time for conversations beyond pleasantries. Antonio sighed, setting the coffee cup down with a clink. He glanced at the room across the hall, where his grandson's toys once spilled over the carpet. That room was his now. The boy, Diego, was too young to remember the house in the countryside, the way Antonio used to scoop him up and show him the chickens or let him ride Mateo, their loyal dog. Diego had adjusted well to life in the city, but Antonio could feel the subtle tension every time he passed the room, an unspoken reminder that he was occupying a space that wasn't meant for him. When the silence became too much, Antonio often let his mind drift back to the days with Maria. She had been the heart of their farmhouse in the rolling hills outside Monterrey. She could coax life out of the stubbornest soil, her hands working miracles with seeds and water. Their garden had been her pride, and together they had built a life filled with simplicity and love. Antonio remembered the mornings they spent drinking coffee on the porch, the way the sunlight caught Maria's auburn hair, making it seem as though her head glowed. "Antonio," she'd say with a teasing smile, "you're staring again. What's on your mind?" "Just thinking how lucky I am," he'd reply, meaning every word. The warmth of those memories was often overshadowed by the night the fire consumed everything. It had been a simple mistake, a candle left burning during a power outage. He had fallen asleep on the couch, exhausted from working in the fields. By the time he woke, thick smoke filled the room, and flames licked the walls. The neighbors had pulled him out just in time, but Maria's belongings, their shared life, and the house itself were gone. Only the charred remains of the foundation were left to haunt him. Mateo, their dog, had disappeared in the chaos. Antonio had spent weeks searching, but there was no trace. It wasn't just a house he had lost that night, it was the anchor to his life. Antonio's 72nd birthday arrived on a Thursday. The day began with a brief, distracted greeting from Carlos as he rushed to work. Elena offered a hug and a cheerful, "Feliz cumpleaños, Papa," before hurrying to get Diego ready for school. A small slice of cake, left on the kitchen counter by their neighbor Sofia, was the only acknowledgement of the day. Antonio sat at the dining table, staring at the cake. It was chocolate, his favorite. The thoughtfulness brought a fleeting smile to his lips, but it quickly faded. He picked at the frosting with a fork, the silence of the empty house pressing down on him. Later that evening, when Carlos returned home, Antonio summoned the courage to speak. "Carlos," he began, his voice firmer than usual, "I think it's time for me to go to a nursing home." Carlos stopped mid-step, his brow furrowing. "Papa, what are you talking about? I've been thinking about it for a while. I don't want to be a burden. You and Elena work so hard. And I," his voice cracked slightly, but he steadied himself, "I'm just taking up space." Carlos sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Papa, not now. I've had a long day. We'll talk about this later. Okay?" Antonio wanted to push, to make Carlos understand, but the words wouldn't come. He simply nodded and retreated to his room, his chest heavy with disappointment. That night, he sat at the edge of his bed, clutching the photograph of Maria. "I'm sorry," he whispered, I don't know what to do anymore." The following weeks passed in much the same way. Antonio brought up the nursing home again. But Carlos always brushed it aside. "You're not a burden, Papa," he'd say. But the words felt hollow. Carlos rarely had time to sit with him, to truly listen. Antonio began to withdraw further. He spent hours staring out the window or reading Maria's letters, which he had saved in a small box under his bed. Her words were a lifeline, reminding him of a time when he was needed, when his presence mattered. One evening, their neighbor Sofia stopped by with a tray of tamales. "They don't want you here, Antonio," she said bluntly as she placed the tray on the counter. "It's the same everywhere. Once we get old, our children don't know what to do with us." Antonio didn't respond, but her words lingered, feeding his fears. On a bright Saturday morning, Carlos knocked on Antonio's door. He was holding a crisp white shirt and slacks, his expression unreadable. "Papa, pack your things," Carlos said. "We're going on a trip." Antonio froze. His hands trembled as he clutched Maria's photograph. The words echoed in his mind, a mix of relief and sorrow. Finally, he thought, "They're taking me." Antonio sat at the edge of his bed, staring at the empty suitcase Carlos had placed beside him. His heart was heavy as he reached for the neatly folded clothes in his dresser. Each item he packed felt like a piece of himself being tucked away, a farewell to the small room he had called home. However reluctantly, he folded his favorite sweater with meticulous care, smoothing the fabric as though he were preserving a memory. His hands trembled as he added a small wooden box containing Maria's letters. Lastly, he placed the photograph of her atop the pile, her familiar smile staring back at him. Antonio zipped the suitcase shut with a sense of finality, whispering, "I'm sorry, Maria." When Carlos returned, he glanced at the packed suitcase and nodded. "We'll leave in an hour, Papa." Antonio didn't reply. He simply sat there, clutching the handle of the suitcase, his knuckles white. His mind swirled with questions he dared not ask. Where will they take me? How long before I'm forgotten? The car hummed quietly as they pulled out of the driveway. Antonio sat in the backseat, his suitcase resting against his knees. Carlos drove in silence, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. Elena sat in the passenger seat, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her lips curled into a faint smile, a look that puzzled Antonio. It felt out of place, a hint of joy on what he believed was a somber day. The city streets soon gave way to the rolling countryside. Antonio gazed out the window, taking in the familiar sight of wildflowers dotting the fields and tall oak trees standing against the horizon. The landscape brought a flood of memories, of Maria laughing beside him during long drives, of Diego perched on his lap as he guided the steering wheel down a dirt road. The ache in his chest grew heavier. "Where are we going?" Antonio finally asked, his voice breaking the silence. "You'll see," Carlos replied, his tone cryptic but calm. Antonio gripped his suitcase tighter. He had asked Carlos to take him to a nursing home, but something about this trip felt different. The road stretched endlessly ahead, winding through thick clusters of trees. There were no signs of houses or people, only the occasional fence lining the road. The uncertainty gnawed at him. Was this a nursing home far from the city? A place to be forgotten entirely? After what felt like hours, the car slowed, crunching over gravel as it turned into a clearing. Antonio's heart raced as he glanced around. The dense trees parted to reveal an open space, sunlight streaming through the branches. Carlos parked the car and stepped out, opening the back door for Antonio. "We're here, Papa," he said, offering a hand to help him out. Antonio hesitated, his legs stiff as he swung them out of the car. His gaze darted around the clearing, searching for the dull, gray facade of a nursing home. But there was no building in sight. Then he saw it. His breath caught in his throat, and his knees buckled. Before him stood a house he recognized all too well. His house. But it wasn't the blackened shell he had last seen after the fire. It was whole, pristine, and alive. The white paint gleamed in the sunlight. The porch railings were sturdy and new, and the windows sparkled with a clarity that felt surreal. "Papa, careful." Carlos caught him as he staggered back, his hand clutching at Carlos's arm for support. Antonio's voice trembled as he stammered. What is this? How?" Carlos smiled, his eyes glistening. "Welcome home, Papa." Antonio stood frozen, his mind struggling to reconcile what he was seeing. Elena stepped forward, carrying his suitcase, her smile warm and inviting. Come inside, Antonio. There's so much to show you. His feet moved on their own, each step up the porch feeling surreal. He brushed his fingers over the smooth, freshly painted railing, his senses flooded with the scent of pine and varnish. Carlos pushed open the front door, and Antonio's breath hitched. The interior was a perfect blend of the familiar and the new. Polished wood floors reflected the soft, warm light streaming through the windows. The walls were painted in hues that Maria had loved, gentle yellows and creams that made the house feel alive. On the mantel above the fireplace, a photograph caught Antonio's eye. It was their wedding photo, the one that had hung in their bedroom for decades. His knees felt weak as he stepped closer, his hand trembling as he reached for the frame. How? He whispered, turning to Carlos. Carlos gestured toward the armchair by the window, reupholstered in the same floral fabric Maria had chosen years ago. Sit, Papa. I'll explain. Antonio sank into the chair, his fingers gripping the armrests. It felt just as it had before, as though the fire had never touched it. Carlos knelt beside him, his voice steady but thick with emotion. We never planned to take you to a nursing home, Papa. We knew how much this house meant to you. When it burned down, Elena and I made it our mission to rebuild it. Every nail, every beam, it's all for you. Antonio stared at him, his vision blurring with tears. But, the land? I signed papers to sell it. Carlos smiled, pulling a worn envelope from his pocket. You didn't sell it, Papa. Those papers were construction permits. We couldn't tell you. It had to be a surprise. Elena chimed in, placing a gentle hand on Antonio's shoulder. The neighbors helped too. Everyone wanted to bring this house back to life. They all remembered Maria and what this home meant to her. Antonio's tears spilled freely as he clutched the photograph of Maria to his chest. He was speechless, his heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. Just as Antonio thought his heart couldn't take any more, a soft bark echoed from outside. His head snapped toward the window, his breath catching as he saw Mateo, his loyal dog, bounding toward the porch. Antonio bolted to his feet, moving faster than he had in years. He stepped onto the porch just as Mateo leapt into his arms, tail wagging furiously. Antonio buried his face in Mateo's fur, his sobs muffled by the dog's warmth. Carlos and Elena stood on the porch, watching the reunion with quiet smiles. Mateo wandered into town after the fire. Elena explained, the neighbors took care of him until we could bring him back. Antonio stroked Mateo's head, his voice breaking. You're alive? You're alive? For the first time in years. Antonio felt a glimmer of hope. The house, Mateo, and his family, it was as if his life had been pieced back together, one fragment at a time. Antonio stepped back inside the house, Mateo trotting faithfully by his side. His hand brushed the walls as though confirming they were real, his senses overwhelmed by the familiar scent of wood and varnish. Every corner of the house felt alive with memories that Carlos and Elena had painstakingly restored. Carlos led Antonio to the kitchen, where the table was set with fresh tamales, steaming coffee, and a small vase of wildflowers. We thought you might want to share your first meal back in your home, Carlos said, his voice soft. Antonio's throat tightened. He lowered himself into the chair that had always been his spot at the table. Mateo curled up at his feet, a quiet presence anchoring him. Carlos poured a cup of coffee, the rich aroma stirring emotions Antonio thought he had long buried. As they ate, Antonio's gaze drifted to the window, where the sun bathed the garden in golden light. The garden, he murmured, his voice trailing off. Carlos smiled. We left it for you, Papa. We thought you'd want to plant it yourself. Antonio looked at his son, his vision blurred with tears. He nodded, unable to speak. For years, he had believed he was a burden, a shadow of the man he used to be. But sitting here, surrounded by love and effort, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, purpose. After the meal, Carlos guided Antonio to the living room and handed him a small leather-bound book. This, Carlos said, is something we managed to save after the fire. Antonio opened the book, his hands trembling. The yellowed pages were filled with Maria's elegant handwriting. It was her journal, a record of their life together, her dreams, and her love for their family. Antonio read a few lines aloud, his voice breaking. Antonio worked so hard today. I wish he'd take a break. But he's stubborn as always. I love him for it. I hope one day Diego will see how much his grandfather has given us." He closed the journal and held it to his chest, his tears falling freely. "She wrote about us," he whispered. "She wanted this house to be a home. Not just for us but for everyone who came after." Carlos placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "She's still here, Papa, in every part of this house. And so are you." The next morning, Antonio woke early. For the first time in years, he felt light, as though the weight of loneliness had been lifted. Mateo barked eagerly as Antonio pulled on his boots and stepped outside. The garden was a blank canvas, the soil freshly tilled and waiting. Antonio crouched down, his hands sinking into the earth. The smell of dirt filled his senses, grounding him. Memories of planting alongside Maria flooded back, her laughter, her gentle guidance, the joy of seeing life sprout from the soil. Carlos joined him later, carrying a tray of seedlings. "We brought these for you," he said, handing Antonio small pots of tomatoes, peppers, and marigolds. Elena picked the marigolds. She said they were Mama's favorite. Antonio nodded, his heart swelling. "They were," he said. "She used to say they brought light to the garden." As the day wore on, Antonio worked tirelessly, the physical labor renewing his spirit. Carlos stayed by his side, following his father's instructions and learning the rhythms of the land. By evening, the first rows of plants were in place, and Antonio stood back to admire their work. "She would have loved this," Antonio said quietly. "Maria would have loved to see us here, working together." Carlos placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "She's here, Papa, in every flower, every blade of grass." Word of Antonio's return spread quickly through the small community. By the end of the week, neighbors began stopping by, bringing fresh bread, pies, and small gifts for the house. One afternoon, Elena arrived with Diego in tow. The boy, now 6, had only faint memories of the farmhouse. But as soon as he saw Mateo, he squealed with delight and ran to the dog, wrapping his arms around him. Antonio knelt beside Diego, his heart swelling. "Do you want to help me in the garden, mijo?" he asked. Diego's eyes lit up. "Can I?" Together, they planted more rows of flowers and vegetables. Antonio's hands guided Diego's small ones, teaching him how to pat the soil gently around each seedling. Diego's laughter filled the air, blending with Mateo's happy barks. Carlos and Elena watched from the porch, their hands intertwined. "This is what he needed," Elena said softly, "a place to feel alive again." Over the next few months, Antonio transformed the garden into a vibrant tapestry of color and life. The marigolds bloomed in bright clusters, their golden petals a testament to Maria's memory. The vegetables thrived under Antonio's care, and neighbors began to visit regularly, asking for advice or simply to sit and chat. Antonio found himself mentoring young children in the community, teaching them the basics of gardening. They reminded him of Diego and Maria, of the future he thought he had lost. Each day brought new purpose, and with it, a sense of fulfillment he hadn't felt in years. Carlos continued to visit on weekends, helping with repairs and projects around the house. Their bond deepened with each passing day, their conversations filled with warmth and laughter. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Antonio sat on the porch with Carlos and Elena. Mateo lay at his feet, and Diego played in the garden. Antonio clutched Maria's journal, his fingers brushing over the worn leather. "I thought I had lost everything," he said quietly, his voice filled with emotion. "But you've shown me that love doesn't count burdens, it only counts blessings." Carlos reached over, clasping his father's hand. "You're not a burden, Papa, you're our foundation." Antonio looked out at the garden, the house, and his family. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe it. Morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, casting a warm glow on the room. Antonio sipped his coffee, the aroma mingling with the faint scent of marigolds drifting in from the garden. For the first time in years, he felt like himself again, a man with a purpose. Mateo lay curled by the door, his ears perked at the faint sounds of Diego laughing outside. The boy had taken to visiting often, eager to help his grandfather in the garden. Their bond grew stronger with each passing day, and Antonio found himself sharing stories about Maria, about the life they had built in this very house. "She loved these marigolds," Antonio said one morning. kneeling beside Diego as they weeded the garden. She used to say they were little suns that brightened every corner of the garden. Diego looked up, his face smeared with dirt but glowing with curiosity. Do you think she'd be proud of our garden, abuelo? Antonio smiled, ruffling the boy's hair. I know she would be. Mijo. Carlos continued to visit every weekend, often bringing supplies for the house or tools to help Antonio with repairs. The time they spent together became a healing process for both father and son. Conversations that had once been strained were now filled with warmth and understanding. One Saturday, as they worked to repair the chicken coop behind the house, Carlos paused, wiping sweat from his brow. Papa, he began, hesitating. I never meant to make you feel like a burden. Antonio stopped hammering and looked at his son. I know that now, mijo, but at the time, I didn't understand. Carlos's eyes softened. I was so focused on work, on trying to provide for the family, that I didn't see how lonely you were. I thought rebuilding the house would fix everything. Antonio placed a hand on his shoulder. You've done more than rebuild a house. Carlos, you've brought our family back together. The two men shared a quiet moment, the bond between them stronger than ever. Antonio's garden flourished, becoming the envy of the neighborhood. People began stopping by not just to admire the flowers and vegetables but to learn from Antonio. He started holding informal gardening lessons, teaching children and adults alike how to nurture the earth. Among the visitors was a woman named Rosa, an elderly widow who had lived in the area for decades. She often brought fresh baked bread and stayed to chat with Antonio about their shared love of gardening. You've brought life back to this place, Antonio, Rosa said one afternoon, admiring the rows of tomatoes and peppers. It reminds me of when this town was full of families working together. Antonio smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest. This garden is as much theirs as it is mine. Maria would have wanted it that way. Rosa nodded, her eyes twinkling. She'd be proud of you, Antonio. As summer turned to fall, Carlos and Elena decided to host a family gathering at the farmhouse. Relatives and neighbors filled the house and garden, their laughter echoing through the air. Long tables were set up in the yard, adorned with fresh flowers and dishes prepared by everyone who attended. Antonio stood on the porch, taking it all in. Mateo sat faithfully by his side, his tail wagging as children darted around the yard. Carlos approached, holding a glass of lemonade. It's a full house, Papa. Antonio nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude. It feels like home again. As the evening wore on, Diego ran up to Antonio, pulling him toward the garden. Abuelo, come see, he exclaimed, his face alight with excitement. Antonio followed the boy to the garden, where Diego pointed to a small patch of marigolds that had just begun to bloom. Their golden petals glowed in the fading sunlight, a testament to the care and love that had gone into planting them. She'd love this, Antonio said softly, his voice tinged with emotion. Over the months, Antonio took on the role of mentor, not just to Diego but to the younger generation in the community. He taught them not only the practical skills of gardening but the deeper lessons it held, the importance of patience, care, and nurturing life. One day, while showing Diego how to prune a rose bush, Antonio paused and looked at the boy. Do you know why your abuela loved gardening so much? Diego shook his head. Why, abuelo? She used to say that every plant was like a promise. Antonio said, if you care for it, it will grow into something beautiful. It's the same with people. Mijo, we all need care to flourish. Diego's eyes widened with understanding. I'll take care of the garden, abuelo, just like you and abuela did. Antonio's heart swelled with pride. I know you will, mijo. As winter approached, the garden began to rest, its vibrant colors fading but its promise enduring. Antonio spent his evenings on the porch, watching the stars and reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. One night, Carlos and Elena joined him, a blanket draped over their shoulders. Carlos handed Antonio a steaming mug of hot chocolate, and the three of them sat in comfortable silence, Mateo snoozing at their feet. You've done so much, Papa, Carlos said after a while. This place is more than a house now. It's a home, for all of us. Antonio smiled, his eyes misting over, and it always will be. As Antonio stood to head inside, Elena placed a hand on his arm, her eyes shining. Papa, she said softly, there's something we want to tell you. Carlos grinned, taking her hand. We're expecting, Papa, a baby. Antonio's breath caught, his heart swelling with joy. A baby, he repeated, his voice trembling. Maria would have loved this. She would, Elena said, tears in her eyes. Antonio looked out at the garden one last time before stepping inside. The circle of life was continuing. And with it, his legacy. Antonio couldn't sleep that night. The news of the baby echoed in his mind, filling him with a mix of joy and nostalgia. He sat at the edge of his bed, clutching Maria's journal, turning the pages. He found an entry that seemed almost prophetic. I dream of a day when this house is full of children again. Their laughter filling the air. Antonio and I will sit on the porch, watching them grow, knowing we've built something lasting. Tears welled up as he traced Maria's handwriting. You were right, Maria, he whispered. It's all coming back. The next morning, he called Carlos to the porch. Mateo trotted behind him, tail wagging. Antonio placed a hand on his son's shoulder. Mijo, when the baby comes, I want to make something special for them. A part of this house that's just for them. Carlos smiled, a warmth in his eyes. What do you have in mind, Papa? A treehouse, Antonio said, his voice steady. A place where they can play, dream, and grow. Like the garden, it will be a promise. Carlos grinned. Let's do it. Over the following weeks, Antonio and Carlos worked together to construct the treehouse. It became a family project, with Elena helping to paint and Diego eagerly holding tools for his grandfather. Even neighbors stopped by to lend a hand, reinforcing the sense of community that had blossomed since Antonio's return. The treehouse took shape in the sturdy branches of an old oak tree at the edge of the property. Antonio insisted on adding small details, a carved wooden railing, wind chimes made from repurposed metal, and a small ladder with Diego's help. One evening, as they admired their progress, Carlos turned to his father. Papa, you're giving this baby something more than a treehouse. You're giving them roots. Antonio nodded, his gaze fixed on the treehouse. Maria would have wanted that. Months passed, and winter gave way to spring. The garden began to bloom once more, its vibrant colors mirroring the joy that filled the house. Mateo barked excitedly one morning as Carlos rushed into the kitchen, his face alight with urgency. It's time, he said, grabbing the hospital bag. Elena's contractions have started. Antonio felt a rush of emotions, excitement, worry, and an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Go, he said, his voice firm. I'll watch Diego. Carlos hesitated but nodded. Thank you, Papa. As Carlos and Elena sped off, Antonio turned to Diego, who was sitting at the kitchen table with wide eyes. Come on, mijo, Antonio said, smiling. Let's keep busy. We'll plant something special today. They spent the day in the garden, planting marigolds in neat rows. Diego asked questions about his new sibling, and Antonio answered with patience and warmth, sharing stories about Maria and their life on the farm. That evening, as they sat on the porch, Carlos called with the news. It's a girl, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Her name is Sofia. Antonio's breath caught. Sofia, he repeated. Your mama would be so proud. When Elena and baby Sofia returned home, the house felt more alive than ever. Antonio spent hours with the baby, rocking her in his arms and telling her stories about the family she was born into. Diego took his role as a big brother seriously, often sitting beside Antonio to watch over Sofia. Abuelo, he asked one day, do you think she'll like the garden when she's older? Antonio chuckled. She'll love it, mijo, and you'll be the one to show her. As the months passed, Sofia grew, her laughter filling the house just as Maria had dreamed. Antonio found himself more active than ever, tending to the garden, playing with Diego, and caring for Mateo. His days were full, his heart even fuller. On Sofia's first birthday, Carlos and Elena hosted another family gathering. The treehouse was decorated with ribbons, and the garden was in full bloom. Friends and neighbors arrived with gifts, laughter echoing through the air. Antonio sat on the porch, watching the festivities. Sofia was in Elena's arms, her tiny hands reaching for the marigolds that Diego held out to her. Mateo barked happily, running circles around the children. Carlos approached Antonio, a glass of lemonade in hand. Papa, he said, sitting beside him, this is all because of you. Antonio shook his head. No, mijo, this is because of us. Because of love, and because we never gave up. Carlos smiled, placing a hand on his father's shoulder. You've shown me what it means to build a home. Not just with bricks and wood, but with heart. Antonio gazed out at the garden, the house, and his family. It's a legacy, he said softly, one that will last. Years later, Antonio sat on the same porch, now older but still full of life. The garden was more vibrant than ever, tended by Diego, who had taken over much of the work. Sofia, now 5, played in the treehouse with her friends, their laughter carrying on the breeze. Carlos and Elena sat beside Antonio, their hands intertwined. The kids are growing fast, Carlos said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. Antonio nodded. They are, but that's how it should be. This house, this garden, it's for them now. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of gold and pink, Antonio felt a deep sense of peace. He had thought he'd lost everything, but in truth, he had gained more than he could have imagined. His family, his home, and the love that bound them were stronger than ever. Maria, he whispered, looking up at the stars. We did it. The wind rustled the marigolds in the garden, as if answering him, and for the first time in a long while, Antonio knew he had fulfilled her dream and his own.